Hello, and welcome to another interview with Just in Time Worlds. With me today is my anthropologist, PhD friend. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Kathleen. I am many things. I'm an anthropologist. I love world building. I work for a company called Unending, helped founded that, which is all about sort of role-playing games and world building and how to kind of keep sense and do all that. So we're working hard on that. But really, this is mostly about my passion about talking about people and worlds and cultures and all the things that make them hard and interesting and complex and kind of can really add to your stories and your world building.
And today we're going to talk about empires, how they're different from kingdoms, how they're formed, and examples from our world and what happens when you introduce fantasy. So I guess let's start with, what is an empire?
Interesting to get into kind of political kind of creation and what that looks like. And, kingdoms oftentimes are very much based around this idea of a shared identity. If we think about major kingdoms and sort of how they line up with current countries in our own world, there's a lot of overlap there, right? That kind of whole nation state idea developed out of that. So there's an attempt, at least, to kind of create a uniformity of culture and identity. And that's never easy or just quite that simple, but that there is that kind of, we are all Americans or Britons or, Finns or whatever we might be. But empires are interesting. And we see empires in a lot of TV shows and movies and books and things like that. But empires are a mishmash. Right? They are sort of one group of people that decides that they're going to really expand and kind of go big on territorial, but they sort of, there's an awareness of there are already local systems of government and governance in place. There are local identities, and it doesn't try to quash those. It creates unifying threads of identity through them, but it really kind of leaves a lot of those systems of culture in place, and just kind of puts this sort of formal bureaucracy on top. So it's less of an identity per se, at least in the beginning, and more kind of this sort of layer, this kind of icing of, kind of bureaucratic taxes and, kind of road systems sometimes and things like that get kind of layered in. Now, eventually that begins to change, and you sort of see the evolution of empires kind of gaining levels of their own identity. And what that means, it can be interesting because how that competes sometimes with a very local identities that happen, lots of friction points in there. But that's kind of the big overarching difference, I think, from that kind of that cultural identity based aspect.
I mean, one of the first empires that I know of, anyway, that's in any way documented is the Persian Empire. And I found a very interesting anecdotal story about Emperor Cyrus in the Persian Empire, where supposedly he felt such compassion for the conquered nations in the Persian Empire that he returned their god idols to them. Yeah, because the god idols had been taken, because that often happens when empires form, is they go and take the stuff from, whatever nation they'd conquered. I mean, let's talk a little bit about the Persian Empire.
It's fun because it's not always very well documented, and there are several of them and kind of their different moments. But yeah, largely sort of a steppe people that kind of pushed out in different ways and began to kind of slowly but surely conquer lots of very different spaces. So if you look at the Persian Empire and sort of how they extended their reach into, say, sort of the Mesopotamian area versus into sort of modern day Egypt. But then, that's fairly well documented. But the stuff that was happening out in what's now Afghanistan, that was like the Wild West, essentially, of what was happening, because it was not well recorded. I don't think there was.
Really kind of similar. I mean, nothing's changed.
Well, also true. Right? It is definitely certainly harder to know anything about and harder to control. If you've never been, I got to spend some time in Afghanistan. If you've never been, it's like the terrain itself is just like, no, please, no one comes in here. They're very independent peoples out that way. The Persian Empire was great because they didn't invent, but borrowed this idea of satrapy. So they had these satraps. And so it was just this really interesting system. And early on, you had, basically, this was how you had administrators or governors for these local areas. So, the empire was bureaucratically divided into all of these spaces that roughly mapped into where a lot of those local cultures and kingdoms and nationalities had been before. Initially, these were the satraps, the sort of leaders, the governors, were appointed by the emperor. And so there was very much this, close, trusted people that you would sort of put, and they were kind of your representatives out there. But you spend enough time out in a place, and you get kind of tied into the local cultures. And so sooner or later, you're going to get where your loyalties might lie, gets a little iffy. And then eventually it emerged into being something that was a hereditary role, which it wasn't necessarily at first. And then the emperor, to kind of make sure that he was keeping loyalties, would send like your the chief of your guards, your highest level general, and your tax collector, and all sorts of special investigators would be all directly loyal to the emperor. So there were these kind of checks and balances built in to make sure that nobody was going too far off the rails. They absolutely did go off the rails, and did all sorts of uprising.
So it's interesting to me, the different approaches to governing the provinces, as one might call it. If I think of the Roman Republic, which they can call themselves a republic if they like, but they were an empire, ultimately. There, the leaders of the provinces, or the person in charge of the provinces, tended to be the consul, who was then given, their choice of a command. And basically, not even joking, command of the provinces was seen as the consul's means to get rich after, serving Rome as a consul. It was a reward, which is very weird to think of from a modern perspective, where such an approach would be a very antithetical to our modern day ethics.
So except maybe with ambassadors, right? Those are oftentimes ways that we reward people. I mean, they don't get quite as rich, but they
yeah, that you get to have swanky positions in great countries, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Versus some of the less desired positions.
Yeah,
no, it's interesting too. You think about the kind of the Roman Republic that evolved into the whole empire. But the interesting, what I find interesting about the kind of Roman example is that idea of citizenship. Right, and how that was extended and where that was extended and what that looked like. And because that's a very active effort to create some kind of Roman identity that transcended a lot of those little smaller Gallic and other kind of identities that were out there. And that you could kind of that balance, that trade-off that individuals were then making to where do their loyalties lie and where is it beneficial. That's kind of fascinating, very deliberate work to kind of get populations a little more under control.
And what was really fascinating about that was that citizenship didn't come into it until they became an empire, until they stopped being a republic. Because at the point where they were a republic, Roman citizenship, proper Roman citizenship, was very tightly controlled, because with it came voting rights. You might be living in Italy, part of the Latin territories, without being a Roman citizen because of the voting rights. But once they became an empire and was hereditary positions passed down, that's when you see them actually start nation building. And when you have like the Roman culture being exported along with, the Roman soldiers looting the countryside.
We give a little culture, we take a little culture. Soldier's way.
Yep. It is kind of how it goes sometimes in our history.
Yeah, I mean, it is a sad, but just kind of, if you don't pay people enough, that's what they're going to do, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, empire forms by expansion, right? Empires don't form with sunshine and roses and
by conquest. It's sort of the Persian Empire also had, standing armies and militaries, and they had sort of reserve type units as well, where people could be called up. But it was interesting always, as I was looking into some of this recently, how they took advantage of the fact that they still had these very distinct cultural ideas about warfare. And they said, all right, well, you're good with boats, so we're going to make you part of a naval force. And you're good with archery, so now we've got that. And you guys are good with horses, now you're sort of a cavalry unit. And sort of, kind of kept those ideas together, and we're sort of pulling units from these different cultural heritages about how to do fighting.
Yeah, and I mean that's smart. It's smart to use your resources like that, for sure. So I guess, why do empires eventually go into decline, and sort of what happens when they start breaking up?
There's probably entire books on this kind of thing. Like I know there are, but I think, kind of from that cultural perspective, identity is hard, right? And if one of the big drivers that we see of breakup of any kind of sort of even today modern states is a sense of inequality. Whether or not that's necessarily true and how great that disparity is up for grabs. But it's the belief that like you are being treated as less than you deserve. And so, that kind of, you get enough of a population base who's sort of beginning to feel that, and then they have some kind of old identity that they can latch onto, and cultural elements or religious elements or whatever, or military elements. And so then you begin to see this kind of pushback. Somehow if we get rid of the oppressing empirical force, that will be just fine, which, debatable whether that's necessarily true, but in different cases, more or less so. But there's very much that idea. And so you start to see these little rebellions popping up all over the place. And when you have enough of them, and then you have, say your satraps or your councils who are, taking advantage of that. So like, hey, I could be a satrap here, or I could be a king, depending on, how I play my cards. If I've intermarried locally enough, then maybe then I've got some kind of ties there. And so sort of just see that kind of those fracture points. And once one group begins to do it, a lot of times it's like dominoes. The next one kind of looks over, like, hey, we could do that too. And then if you're trying to deal with multiple sort of insurgencies or revolutions, depending on what you want to call them, at the same time, at a certain point, like you just keeping track of all of that gets very difficult. And then they just start, people stop paying things like taxes. So all of your bureaucratic processes just fall down because now you're not paying anyone, and all your roads are no longer being kept up. And so moving your troops everywhere gets harder. So there's kind of these compounding effects that just kind of make it more and more difficult to govern at scale, especially in a time where you don't have the kind of communication systems that we do today, right? Like where I can't be, I can be on the other side of America in 5-6 hours, but that was just not a thing. And so a sense of scale matters.
And I mean, that's a very interesting point that you raised there about like, once it's successfully achieved, the first one to successfully achieve it starts the domino effect. But it's also, if I think about the Romans again, what's interesting is they started to experience that as the Republic, right? As the Republic, there was starting to be little revolutions, people pushing for citizenship, internal conflict. But instead of falling apart as an empire and dissolving into its component parts, what happened was they had what amounts to I don't want to call it a non-violent revolution, because there was obviously violence, there was a lot of civil war, but it was a non-devastating revolution that resulted in the then birth of empire under, the first dictator for life, Caesar. And it's interesting how it actually seems to require a change in form of government. I mean, a more recent example actually is the Russian Empire and its change into the Soviet Union, which is topical for me because I live here, right, in Finland. At the time when the Russian Empire was at the point of falling, the Russian emperor was the Tsar of Russia, he was the King of Poland, he was the Grand Duke of Finland, and he was the Emperor of the Russian Empire. All of those titles at the same time. Busy guy. The funny thing is that he was governing Finland and Poland under a constitutional monarchy, but Russia had no constitution. And that was the heart of the revolution that drove communism, was Russia's lack of constitution governing, the Tsar's power. And their transformation into then the Soviet Union is actually also just another empire. It's just an emperor with I'm not going to dignify it by saying an elected emperor, but, like a fake election.
Election.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, right? You look at, say, kind of the Emperor of China, right? Kind of historically and what that's looked like, and sort of relations that China had with its sort of near neighbors, where like you look at China and what is now Korea, and has been various different sort of kingdoms at different points, right? And there's even kind of a more hands-off approach there, where there's, there are relations and there's some nominal fealty, but largely just, Korea's off doing its own thing, with the different kingdoms that have now become Korea. So it kind of, even more hands off. And that one didn't really so much fall apart as, right, there was I think got kind of swept up in the kind of, if you think about the 20th century and what that looked like for a rise of nation states, right? So, giant kind of global changes in understanding of what appropriate government and governance look like, right? That can also be a killer. Ottoman Empire, right? Also huge military losses. That'll destroy your empire for you too.
Yeah, if you have massive military losses, too weirdly, the Russian Empire laid a lot of beat down onto the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, of course, were the inheritors, I think, of the Golden Horde, weren't they? No. Ottomans, Byzantium, aren't they?
Yeah, so that kind of
Roman.
Eastern Roman Empire, but with a very different feel and flavor that became sort of a more, after the Islamic empires that were kind of their own.
Brought about in part by crusades. So let's talk about the church as the empire, because I feel that there is way too little discussion about the essential imperialistic nature of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. No, the Pope didn't have an executive branch, but if you wanted to be crowned a king of any Christian nation, you needed a bishop to put the crown on your head, which is the equivalent of having an empire.
Yeah, it's what's interesting in some ways that I don't know as much about sort of kind of early Chinese history and sort of the way they engage, but from my understanding, there's a similarity there where the ability to ultimately appoint the regent or the kind of local leader was entirely sort of in the hands of that kind of centralized figure in more or less stated at different points, right? They may not have always had that kind of direct authority, but they have a divine authority that gets very much of the same thing. And taxes and tithes, right? Always nice.
Oh yeah, but that's pretty much the same thing, let's be honest. If you look at what the Roman Catholic Church wrought in those early centuries, and I mean, I'm specifically now talking before the Reformation and all the changes that came with it, the Pope could call for holy war and did. I mean, that was why there were crusades. So he had, in effect, a military force. He had a whole bunch of nation states that shared a cultural identity of a sort, which is the Christian faith. And even though they had internal wars, I mean, they did. They still killed each other quite as happily as they killed anybody else. They did acknowledge their Christianity above their nation state. And I guess that speaks again to that imperial flavor where you have a veneer over the top of the nations.
Yeah, there's sort of something that sort of unites you. I mean, granted, most of the leaders of the various countries within that space were all, the same family or two anyway, which doesn't hurt either. And they're usually all related to the Pope in some way or another.
The supposedly celibate Pope, that one, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This is father's cousins, former.
It's funny because if you ever do those DNA tests, which I haven't because I'm not that interested, but if you ever do them, they cannot tell the difference between German DNA and French DNA because the two nations are like
divided by a not so common language, ironically.
Yeah, the language is different, but
that's another thing too. Is interesting about empires is the languages that they use. If I think about early Korean nations, they all use sort of all in that space. They used the Chinese characters. If you think about right there were the sort of lingua francas that sort of divine. I think ultimately wound up being largely Armenian for the Persian Empire at a certain point, because it was easier to read and write than some of the other ones. And so it's interesting sort of which languages get picked up and used, and it's not always clear. And you'd expect it to be, well, who was the first conqueror and it's their language. But it's not always the case, which I find interesting.
It is interesting. It's especially interesting if you look at, for example, as you say, the Armenian tongue that came to be the Persian language. That wasn't what the Persians spoke originally. And sometimes it's about, I guess, the ease of writing. Often it's the ease of writing more than anything else, more than the ease of speaking. Let's talk some fantasy empires. Star Wars. I don't feel that Star Wars is that much of an empire. Yeah, sure, the emperor controls the planets, but I'm not seeing a unifying force going there. I'm seeing a lot of iron fisting going on, and I don't think an iron fist really makes an empire.
I think So if you want to go super into Star Wars, the kind of the republic that came beforehand, maybe, right? Because there were still, I mean, everyone was a local government. You could be a prince or a princess or whatever of your own thing, but still have these representatives to this kind of UN type council that made decisions maybe a little more intense than a UN, because they had governing authority and they had ability to enforce and things like that. So there was this kind of this shared idea of we all belong to this broader thing, but we're also very independent. And that's, I mean, if you watched the prequel trilogy or read any of the books or the TV shows and things, there's a lot of contestation in that space of my authority versus yours, and when do they end, and what does that mean? So I think maybe that's a better example from the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, I feel that oftentimes fantasy writers tend to think that an empire can be controlled with an iron fist. And I don't think an empire can. I think a kingdom can. I think you can put your fist on the throat of a kingdom-sized population and control it. But an empire is too big.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I think that's exactly right. Right, this idea that empires are formed through the sword often, but often by marriage too, and lots of other. There's a lot more political delicacy that goes into building and maintaining an empire than, like you say, a kingdom, right? Because it's especially one that lasts, one that endures, right? You might get a brief stint where you get, Alexander the Great goes around and conquers a whole bunch of people, but it only really lasts as long as he was alive,
and then it kind of fell apart.
So that idea of the sword being a way to keep people united, I don't think is very strong, because it's a political dance, and depending on your cultures, it will be kind of intermarriages or whatever other kind of alliance building things you have like that. It will be taxes, but also then giving back, right? So tax, we tend to think about evil sort of tax mongers, right? But it's often to build roads or postal services, right? That's a great sign, but giving people safety as they're moving around, and sort of security in bad times, where you can sort of share wealth. If you've got a really bad harvest over in this part of the empire, but we're doing okay over here, you can but there's a political deftness. And then being able to kind of really balance and sort of listen to where all these local cultural challenges are happening, or people are pushing back or angry, and being able to kind of get ahead of that. Yeah, it would be a very deft touch, I think, to maintain that kind of system.
I'm thinking now of the last time that I saw an empire that was kind of realistic, and this is weird because I don't often use these words together, but David Eddings's Tamuli Empire was semi-realistic. I don't know if you ever read the Sparrow books.
It's been a long time.
In the second series, there is an empire where you have multiple different kingdoms inside the empire. And the guys who are in charge of the empire, the Tamuli, one of the things that happens is the emperor marries a bride from each of the 9 different kingdoms that form the empire. Like that kind of, political negotiations of, no, we're all equal, we're all in this together, nobody kill each other, all that kind of thing. That to me was an interesting approach. And then if I think of the other empire that I've seen that was realistic, was Raymond Feist's Keshan Empire. What I found great there was you actually had enemies within the empire, like nation states who hated each other and would be at war if it wasn't for the empire enforcing peace. I don't know how long that would last. Like, I think eventually one of the two of them is gonna go at it. But what if you added magic to empire? Like, would it make a difference, do you think?
I was actually just thinking that as you were talking about that, magic or religion in a way that is, gods are very present, and so it's kind of a magic unto itself. Because that, I think, especially the kind of religion with very real gods, you could sort of see that an evolution of a legitimate empire into something more like a nation state or a kingdom. Because if you have sort of gods that can slowly be kind of overtaking other gods, or doing the kind of adoption thing that sort of happened a lot in sort of South America, where a lot of the Christian saints look a little bit different, a whole lot more like what would be sort of traditional, sort of religious figures in traditional.
They look an awful lot like a god.
They look an awful lot like South American gods that existed before Christianity ever showed up. So, and how they're celebrated and worshipped. But now at this point, right, like that's just all part of, like, that's how they practice Catholicism. But so there's this kind of unifying factor if you can kind of get some of these kind of cultural elements slowly over time that that kind of absorb and kind of other ones, then you could move so that you could kind of create that thing. Now, the other thing that sort of magic gives you is sort of a solution to the problem I said before, where it's very hard to govern large spaces. If you've got abilities to teleport or at least communicate rapidly across different places, it becomes a little bit easier to kind of maintain a little more central control than you might otherwise, just because, right, my messenger, my spy, my special investigators that I have pushed out everywhere, they can write back to me right away. And so I have kind of a lot more knowledge of what's going on, and that allows me to sort of act faster or react faster if I need to certain things if I'm centralized control. Of course, it also gives people more opportunity to be more effective in their uprisings too.
But
so
technology would, like modern day equivalent technology or magical equivalent that gives it to you, would certainly enable some things better.
But like I said, also much easier to go deep underground and literally in some cases, and to kind of fight back. So, it's always a double-edged sword, I think, that way. But it kind of depends too, right? Because if that's part of your veneer, pretty early you can establish like, hey, we're going to make schools for mages. And now all of your, like, it's free. You don't have to pay for some private tutor to make sure your kid doesn't blow up when they, demonstrate magical abilities. And then we can take them and kind of bring them into the center of the empire and brainwash them when they're quite young. Educate them.
Brainwash them is right.
But then you can kind of create sort of, again, you can use that to create identities and things like that, or sort of centralized control of religion if you've got sort of main temples that are all in the main city and that sort of. So there are funny, sneaky ways you could get around that too.
Warhammer 40k jumps to mind. Have you ever looked at the Warhammer 40k universe? Such a gorgeous universe. The Empire of Man. And they have a certain amount of iron-fisted control, but it's a whole religious class that exercises a very stringent religious control over the population. But that actually makes me think about, I think that one of the things in a fantasy world that people should probably pay more attention to is what happens with your different races and empire. Because, we're not talking like just human racial characteristics, which is a skin deep difference, right? Some of these races have got species level differentiation, like a dwarf and an elf versus a human versus a whatever, one of the more animalistic races. And if you start having an empire that incorporates those racial differences that cannot be changed over time, I think you're going to have a lot of fracturing along those kind of species racial lines.
Yeah, if you don't find a good way to incorporate them, I think that would have to, some of that identity building toward a more centralized identity would have to happen early and fast and very deliberately to kind of bring those folks in. So, for example, a world that I was playing in, it was actually my fiance's world. He had a sort of a growing nation of orcs, and they were sort of on the borders of an empire, and the empire decided they were going in there. And it happened that there was a person who was very much a trades-minded person, right? Who was a merchant, saw everything in terms of dollars, and kind of got in there first and said, hey, look, like if you can fight back at this, or you can make a whole lot of money because you've got access to resources and all sorts of things that could totally bring you in. And then, so there was this kind of this deal, and then it, kind of stalled some violence, and then slowly but surely built up through trade alliances, made this kind of a very central part of the kind of economic prosperity of the empire writ large. And so it kind of, a couple hundred years later, there was kind of like, they were just pretty much accepted everywhere because they were known to be very savvy traders and they had access to the resources. And, so there was this kind of finding the way to bring you in and making you the something star of the empire that otherwise would have been pretty hard sell, and probably was early on because there had been a lot of violence at that point beforehand.
Yeah, it's interesting the different forms that one can use with empire. So we've spoken about the religious and the military, more kind of classical model, but you can also have trade empires. If I think of the Venetian Republic, that was very much an empire built on trade.
If you look at, some of the European empires, right, they kind of did during eras of colonialism, right? A lot of those were all the Dutch East India Company, right? Like that was what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't even a country colonizing, it was a company. And that also exercises a certain amount of control and builds a semi-shared identity, which then in time dissolved for many of the same reasons, which is to say people rebel. People don't necessarily want to be part of an empire. Although I will say that sometimes people do want to be part of an empire. Some of the Roman Republic, some of the provinces joined willingly.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are definite, economies of scale, right? If you want to go kind of really that from being sort of part of a larger unit, there's, especially if you're kind of poor and rural and you don't have a lot going for you, that's right. Suddenly a road system is real nice that you don't have to pay to maintain, or just, that maybe there are tax breaks on depending on who you're trading with now that you weren't before. So import export stuff, which it can be an interesting way too, I guess, if you're thinking about being an empire, right? Like if you make imports and exports really difficult to your empire, but if you're part of the system, then it's nice and cheap. Right? Sweeten that deal a little bit.
I mean, we're not calling the European Union an empire, but
I didn't use that.
Like that kind of trade-based bringing people in is a valid point of unification. What do you think is the most fun empire that you've encountered?
I've never lived through any, so it's hard to, kind of.
No.
I mean, probably not the Mongolian.
I think
those would be pleasant.
Yeah, look, the Mongolian empires were, I mean, especially in the way they were conquered. Our boy Kublai Khan was serious business.
Yeah. That's why so many of us have a little bit of Mongolian DNA when you take those DNA tests. I think they just put that in as like a given. Like we don't actually test for it. We just assume.
We just assume that, he got everywhere.
Everywhere. I like the Persian one, right? I feel like it was a pretty early instance of empire in sort of a modern empire kind of take. Just the institutions that they were developing, the complexity, right? Like that, you talk about sort of being able to marry multiple people. Yeah, I totally took advantage of that. And just it lasted a long time and it was never uncontested, but it was complex and hugely bureaucratic. And so I love a good sort of role-playing game or a good fantasy book that has lots of intrigue in it, right? And anything that's heavily bureaucratic has lots of space for intrigue, right? Like it just has that built in. And so just going back and looking at it, like you look at sort of modern governments and you're thinking like, wow, nothing could ever have been that complex in the past, but they always were, right? They've always been that complex. And I think the Persian Empire is a beautiful example of that. And just how you maintain control in that kind of space. So I think that's one of my real world. I think it's possibly my favorite one.
I tend to agree. I find the Persian Empire to be a fascinating study, especially given that their religion was not the unifying force. Because they practiced Zoroastrianism, but they were very open to everybody practicing whatever religion they wanted to practice. They had no particular investment in exercising religious control.
So to get, which makes that idea of like we said, religion with shared identity can be kind of an easy way. So if you don't have that, then it's, what are all the other ways that you need to build that? Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, they were definitely a fun period, and it's part of that period in history that I feel like a lot of fantasy authors neglect to look at when they look at historical examples. Like everybody looks back at the kind of medieval period. I'm like, well, the medieval period is interesting, but if you want to write big, complex governments, go a little further back.
Yeah,
it's there.
Yeah, or even just kind of further east, right? Like just, you think about just, I find some of the sort of early sort of Chinese just ways that they were developing things and institutions that they had, and the opportunities for social mobility that showed up that don't show up anywhere else, right? If you can take a civil service exam and do well, granted, it's easier if you had lots of tutors and things like that, but like in theory, anybody can kind of climb their way up that system. Just kind of like neat, complex systems that are out there, and that were kind of made some of the medieval ones look a little bit like, well, you're kind of just coming out of the dark ages.
That's how they were. But actually, the Chinese model, you're right, the Chinese model is fascinating, especially during the Song imperial period, because those civil service exams were amazing. The fact that anybody could write them, and it gave their government such legitimacy. it engendered such trust from the people in the government, because you knew that every time that you dealt with a bureaucrat, you would be dealing with an educated man who was capable of passing these civil service exams and therefore was competent. So it was like competence was giving your government legitimacy. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Chinese imperium lasted so long.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It had, and those people could be, right. There's a hope engendered in that too, right? Like that could be me if I tried hard on my kids. Maybe it's too late for me. If I try hard enough. I mean, granted, less so if you're a woman, but like the thing about fantasy worlds is you can do away with kind of some of those if you choose. But there was just like you said, a legitimacy is the right word, right? Which is kind of part of that social contract that kind of people buy into. And it was not without its challenges, sure, right? There's lots of turnover and there's the concept and a lot of those institutions didn't go away.
Yeah, I think that if you want to look at empire as a world builder, you could do well to look to the Far East, to the China model, and to the Persian model when they were around. And then if you want to look to the West, the Romans are all good models.
Yeah, agreed.
Closing thoughts on empire.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, go for them, right? They're big and they're difficult and you can do so much more than kingdoms, or you can have kingdom nested within empires, right? That's fine. Play with all of that, play with the tensions that arise from that. And there's a lot of fun to be had, right? Political systems, governance systems have been in effect as long as we've had people, right? So, find interesting new ways to play with that. And then it opens a lot of opportunities for you.
And that is closing thoughts on empires, and I will see you soon for another episode. I hope that you enjoyed that episode of Just in Time Worlds. Please do hit the thumbs up button if you did. If you really enjoyed this and you want to help me make more of these videos, you can buy my book, The Hidden Blade by Marie M. Mullaney, or you can hit my Ko-fi page where you can make a one-off donation, buy a membership, or even buy a product.